Good afternoon. Welcome. We're happy to see you here accessing our recorded sermon for Sunday afternoon, 3 p.m. We are unable to meet at the present time in person, but we commend you for taking this opportunity to tune in, to pull up the recorded sermon. We do hope and pray that you're able to gain from it, as well as with our other recorded instruments like our video Bible lessons. The Sunday morning 10 a.m. Bible lesson on the book of Acts is there for you. Also the Wednesday evening at 6 p.m. our Bible class there working on prophecy and the prophets, that will be there as well. You can also go to our YouTube channel and access any and all of the previous lessons that we've recorded on that channel. Just go to the Bagdad website and go under Resources and click on any of the Wednesday or Sunday Bible studies, and when they come up you can also look for others in that same area. This afternoon we'd like to encourage you to take your Bible and turn to the book of Daniel. In keeping with our study that we've been in for a few months now, of taking a different book of the Bible each time and working our way through a book, taking 1 or 2 or 3 lessons from that book, we have managed to work our way up through everything up to the book of Daniel at this point. The book of Daniel is exciting. Our study through these sermons will not be the same as it would be if we were having a regular Bible study where we would get into more of the details of the book. But what we're looking at with these sermons is an overview and pulling lessons out from some of the high points of this book. Book of Daniel, of course, is one that contains many prophecies and also teaches us a lot about some good, serious Bible principles. We call this book of Daniel the one about dedicating. There are so many good, familiar stories in the book of Daniel that I'm sure you're familiar with. But we'll spend perhaps 3 Sunday evening lesson periods on the book of Daniel. The first one being this afternoon, and we're going to just look at a few of the preliminary items first. This book itself is named after the prophet Daniel, who's a contemporary of the other prophets that we've been studying recently in our Bible study class. He's a contemporary with Ezekiel and with Jeremiah. And we understand that they all had different aspects to their message, but in the end they were all prophets who spoke God's message. Daniel gets more into the high levels of government as far as the target of his prophecy. Some of the other prophets, of course, prophesied more to the everyday person there in Judah or in Babylon while they were under captivity. Daniel's name means God is my judge. The EL there at the end of his name is a suffix that indicates God, and God is my judge is an appropriate way of titling this book. Daniel always looked to God for either approval or guidance or any other aspects of the message he was preaching. Think back to the history of the matter just a little bit. Daniel was among the young nobles and the captives that were taken from Judah to Babylon in the first sweep of Nebuchadnezzar through Judah. These people were taken captive, and as you can see on the map, it was not like the Assyrian captivity, which was to the north, as you see on our screen here, and those captives were spread throughout the Assyrian kingdom. Later on, some of them were brought back to Judah, and they were put back in place there to hold place, I guess, in the land. But the ones that went to Babylon a bit later, about 604 BC, they were taken directly to Babylon over here in the Fertile Crescent, Mesopotamia. And the target of this first wave of captives was the nobles, the princes among Judah. Daniel was one of those. Daniel was one of those princes. We read from Daniel chapter 1 about this beginning of the captivity, starting in verse 3. Then the king instructed Ashpenaz, the master of his eunuchs, to bring some of the children of Israel and some of the king's descendants and some of the nobles, young men in whom there was no blemish, but good-looking, gifted in all wisdom, possessing knowledge and quick to understand, who had ability to serve in the king's palace, and whom they might teach the language and literature of the Chaldeans. And the king appointed for them a daily provision of the king's delicacies, and of the wine which he drank, and 3 years of training for them, so that at the end of that time they might serve before the king. Now from among those nations of Judah were Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Now those names are probably not as familiar to you as some names we'll see later on, the names which they were given by the Babylonians. But these were some of those who were taken captive, and look at how it was described. They were the young men who were gifted in wisdom, who had ability to serve. So apparently Nebuchadnezzar was looking for some of those Jews who could integrate into his kingdom and who could provide somewhat of a foundation of good sense and responsibility and ability to learn and function in the Chaldean society. So that's how they got there to Babylon in the first place. Daniel and some others we read there in that first chapter were selected for some special training. 3 years of training that was to take place with all the goodies of the king's table. And these young men, of course, from Judah were not used to that kind of thing. In fact, many of the things that were offered at the king's table were not things that they would be able to eat according to Jewish law. Verse 7 of Daniel chapter 1 tells us, "To them the chief of the eunuchs gave names. He gave Daniel the name Belteshazzar, to Hananiah Shadrach, to Mishael Meshach, and to Azariah Abednego." Now there's where those other names come in. Daniel purposed in his heart, we're told there in verse 8, though, that he would not defile himself with the portion of the king's delicacies, nor with the wine which he drank. Therefore he requested of the chief of the eunuchs that he might not defile himself. So Daniel's choice here at the very first was that he and the other young princes from Judah would not have to endure the violation of their principles that it would be to eat these delicacies and drink the king's wine and so forth. So we find that as they were taken to serve Nebuchadnezzar, Daniel purposed in his heart another plan, and that plan involved not eating the meat and delicacies from the king's table, but rather the vegetables that were a part of the healthy diet that we know that the Jews practiced in those days. Back in that same chapter 1, Daniel chapter 1, verse 8, notice that we read that already, but get this part. It says, "But Daniel purposed in his heart that he would not defile himself with the king's delicacy." So it was a plan that he had. I would suggest that we can learn from this ourselves. Faced with any kind of dilemma where we have to make a choice, it's good to have a plan. We should think about how we're going to achieve God's purpose in the things that we do according to the best we can gather from His Word. And Daniel did that. He had a purpose in mind as far as how he would handle things in the king's realm. So, Daniel remained true to his commitment. He enlisted God's help, and he also persisted. He didn't take no for an answer the first time, and there was some willingness to endure this test of his faith. Just take a look there, beginning in Daniel chapter 1 and verse 9. "Now God brought Daniel into the favor and goodwill of the chief of the eunuchs. And the chief of the eunuchs said to Daniel, I fear my lord the king, who has appointed your food and drink, for why should he see your faces looking worse than the young men who are your age? Then you would endanger my head before the king." All right, well, you see his reasoning there. If I let you guys go just to a diet of water and vegetables and fruit, maybe you won't turn out as nicely appointed physically as some of those of the king's own table, of his own people. And that could get me in trouble, the eunuch said. So that was an objection. Daniel then, in verse 11, said to the steward whom the chief of the eunuchs had set over Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, he tells him about his plan. But let's back up just a second. What has Daniel done here? Well, first of all, he has enlisted God's help. There in verse 9 we read that Daniel mentions God. Now God had brought Daniel into the favor and goodwill of the chief of the eunuchs. That's how Daniel got to be there. And then he was persistent. When the chief eunuch said, well, I don't think this is such a good idea, Daniel answers to the steward, and he tells him there may be a way to do this. And what it amounts to is a test. Daniel suggests a test, and it's really not a test of the plan that Daniel had. It's more of a test of the ability that he has to exercise his faith. A test of his faith, if you will. Let's go back to Daniel chapter 1, and beginning verse 12, he says, please test your servants for 10 days, and let them give us vegetables to eat and water to drink. And then let our appearance be examined before you, and the appearance of the young men who eat the portion of the king's delicacies, and as you see fit, so deal with your servants. So he consented with them in this matter, and tested them 10 days. Well, Daniel's taking a risk here. What if he and the other Hebrews, the other Jews among the group there, don't turn out to be as healthy as those of the king's servants? The king's young men might indeed continue to thrive, and Daniel's would not. So he's taking a risk here, but his faith is strong enough that he believes God will do the right thing and allow their diet to be the one that's best for them. And sure enough, at the end of 10 days, the Bible tells us in verse 15 here, and at the end of 10 days their features appeared better and fatter in the flesh than all the young men who ate the portion of the king's delicacies. So Daniel's plan worked out. He had the willingness to test his faith. Again, you look at some lessons we might learn from this. We have faith. Our faith is ours because of God's help. God has enabled us to learn and read about and understand the things that bring about faith. And we also are persistent. If we are dealing with some matter of faith, we don't like to get a no answer from the situation we're in. We want to test that faith we have by putting it to some kind of a rigorous encounter. And so Daniel tested his faith. What were the results? Well, as we noticed, it affected the lives of others. Let's go back there to Daniel chapter 1, and we noted verse 15 earlier. It said that after 10 days, the young men who tested with fruit, with vegetable and water, did indeed turn out looking better than the ones who ate the king's delicacies. Look at verse 16 though. Thus the steward took away their portion of delicacies and the wine that they were to drink, and gave them vegetables. If it works for one, it works for all. So the eunuch was kind of wise too. But notice how this happened. It took place because of Daniel's faith and the ability he put into a test of that faith. And now it has affected the lives of others. Others are going to benefit from the things that Daniel learned. They might not have agreed with it, but they sure had to do it because the eunuch said so. And as a result of that, Daniel and his 3 friends enjoyed even more blessings. Let's take a look again at chapter 1 and beginning of verse 17. As for these 4 young men, God gave them knowledge and skill in all literature and wisdom, and Daniel had understanding in all visions and dreams. Now at the end of the days, when the king had said that they should be brought in, the chief of the eunuchs brought them in before Nebuchadnezzar. Then the king interviewed them, and among them all none was found like Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Therefore they served before the king. And in all matters of wisdom and understanding about which the king examined them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and astrologers who were in his realm. Well, there you go. That's proof itself of God's ability to bless these young men based on their faith, of course, and the willingness they had to test that faith, but now they're benefiting from it. Those were the ones who rose to the level of greatness in Nebuchadnezzar's government, much better than the magicians and astrologers he already had. Notice here too that Daniel is the one who was given understanding in all visions and dreams. We're going to come back to that in a later lesson, and you'll see how that plays into a very good situation for Daniel and his friends. Well, some applications of this are important. You notice here that Daniel sought God's help. His faith resulted in good things, but it wasn't just his faith. It was the fact that he included in that a seeking after and a desire to have God's help. Without God, any effort is more likely to fail. The psalmist David tells us in Psalms 127, verses 1 and 2, "Unless the Lord builds the house, they labor in vain who build it. Unless the Lord guards the city, the watchman stays awake in vain. It is for you to rise up early and to sit up late and to eat the bread of sorrows, for so he gives his beloved sleep." Well, if you want to rest well and know that the Lord's hand is over things, then you need to give God a part in it. Unless the Lord builds the house, let God be the guide. Unless he guards the city, then the watchman is in vain. So we hope that that's a lesson we'll gather from what Daniel and his friends practiced. Also, we notice that God will seek to help those who are loyal to him. Daniel and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego's loyalty to God brought to them the loyalty from God that they expected. God would seek to help them. Back in 2 Chronicles chapter 16, it is phrased like this: "For the eyes of the Lord run to and fro throughout the whole earth, to show himself strong on behalf of those whose heart is loyal to him. In this you have done foolishly. Therefore from now on you shall have wars." Now this is spoken back in the time of the United Kingdom of Israel, and then sometimes they had not been loyal to God. And because of that, then they did have wars among their kingdom. But God is said here to show himself strong on the behalf of those whose heart is loyal to him. And that's a lesson that we can put into practice ourselves. If we expect God to assist us, then it just follows that we should be those who have a loyalty to our God, and that we practice that loyalty. Also, Daniel was persistent. Like we said, when the eunuch first said, "I don't think that's a good idea," Daniel didn't give up after meeting that first obstacle. He kept on and said, "Here's something we can do to test this," and did not stop there. And Jesus taught the same thing, didn't he? Jesus taught about persistence. Back in Matthew chapter 7, he spoke about those who keep on asking and seeking and knocking, and how they will receive, and how they will find what they're after, and how doors will be opened unto them. Matthew chapter 7, we'll put that on the screen here. Jesus said, "Ask and it will be given to you. Seek and you will find. Knock and it will be opened to you. For everyone who asks receives, and he who seeks finds, and to him who knocks it will be opened. Or what man is there among you, who if his son asks for bread will give him a stone? Or if he asks for a fish, will he give him a serpent? If you then, being evil, know how to give good gifts to your children, how much more will your Father who is in heaven give good things to those who ask him?" Well, that's the principle that we're seeing right here. And also, like we mentioned, Daniel was willing to test that faith. If we're not willing to have our faith tested and meet obstacles head on and do what we have to overcome them, then how committed are we to trusting God in the first place? God often invited people to test his promises. Back there in the last book of the Old Testament, the prophet Malachi, God has this prophet write to the people of Israel, to the people of Judah, who now are the ones who have returned and are back in Judah again, and they had some problems getting their focus right. He points out here, "Bring all the tithes into the storehouse, that there may be food in my house. And try me now in this, says the Lord of hosts, if I will not open for you the windows of heaven, and pour out for you such blessing that there will not be enough room to receive it." Yeah, God says, here's a way you can test. Bring all the tithes you're supposed to into the storehouse. Do what you're supposed to do with vigor and with enthusiasm, and you watch if I won't open the doors of heaven for you, open the windows and pour out blessings upon you. So Malachi conveyed that message from God. Jesus says so too in Matthew chapter 6. In the Sermon on the Mount, he told his audience there, "Therefore do not worry, saying, what shall we eat? Or what shall we drink? Or what shall we wear? For all these things the Gentiles seek after. For your heavenly Father knows that you need these things. But seek first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and all these things shall be added to you. Therefore do not worry about tomorrow, for tomorrow will worry about its own things. Sufficient for the day is its own trouble. Well, we understand that Jesus was simply pointing us to this principle here, that we should seek God's good things first, and the other things that we need will indeed be added to us. So, from all this, we get some ideas here about how we can use Daniel's faith as an example of how we can treat our own faith and things we can do with it. But as we read further in the book of Daniel, we find in the 3rd chapter another story we'd like to touch on, and this will be all we'll get to this afternoon, but we know the story by heart, most of us, in Daniel chapter 3, where the 3 friends of Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, showed extreme faith in the face of the fire. Remember that story? Daniel chapter 3, Nebuchadnezzar had built this great image. If you turn to chapter 3, very quickly, we'd like to read the beginning of this story, starting in verse 1. So Nebuchadnezzar the king made an image of gold, whose height was 60 cubits, and its width 6 cubits. He set it up in the plain of Dura, in the province of Babylon. And King Nebuchadnezzar sent word to gather together the satraps, the administrators, the governors, the counselors, the treasurers, the judges, the magistrates, and all the officials of the provinces to come to the dedication of the image which King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. So the satraps and all these others, I won't read them all, came. They gathered together for this dedication, and they stood before the image that Nebuchadnezzar had set up. And then a herald cried out aloud, "To you it is commanded, O people, to you it is commanded, peoples, nations, and languages, at the time you hear the sound of the horn, the flute, the harp, the lyre, the psaltery, in symphony with all kinds of music, you shall fall down and worship the gold image that King Nebuchadnezzar has set up. And whoever does not fall down and worship shall be cast immediately into the midst of a burning fiery furnace." So at that time, when all the people heard the sound of the horn, the flute, the harp, and the lyre, and the symphony of all kinds of music, all the people, nations and languages, fell down and worshiped the gold image which King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. All right, so that's the first 7 verses of that chapter. King Nebuchadnezzar was kind of an ego fella. He wanted people to worship him and his image, and he had the wherewithal to make this huge image of gold, and so he did so. When people heard the sound of that music and the horns and all, then they did as they were told, not necessarily out of being great fans of Nebuchadnezzar. Possibly a whole lot of it was the fear of that fiery furnace. Well, they did, though, bow down and worship. But the accusation was made that some didn't do it. Oh, starting in verse 8, "Therefore at that time certain Chaldeans came forward and accused the Jews. And they spoke and said to King Nebuchadnezzar, O king, live forever. You, O king, have made a decree that everyone who hears the sound of the horn, the flute, the harp, the lyre, the psaltery, in symphony with all kinds of music, should fall down and worship the gold image. And whoever does not fall down and worship shall be cast into the midst of a burning fiery furnace. There are certain Jews whom you have set over the affairs of the province of Babylon, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. These men, O king, have not paid due reverence in regard to you. They do not serve your gods or worship the gold image which you have set up." Okay. Well, these 3 Hebrews were not worshipers of Nebuchadnezzar. They weren't worshipers of golden images. For them to worship would have been a violation of their laws under which they operated religiously. Well, that made the king angry, and starting in verse 13, here's his reaction. Nebuchadnezzar, in rage and fury, gave the command to bring Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. They brought these men before the king. Nebuchadnezzar spoke to them and said, "Is it true, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you do not serve my gods or worship the gold image which I have set up?" Now, if you're ready at the time you hear the sound of the horn, the flute, the harp, the lyre, and the psaltery, and all the kinds of music, that you fall down and worship the image which I have made, good. But if you do not worship, you shall be cast immediately into the midst of a burning fiery furnace. And who is the God who will deliver you from my hands? Well, so here was his reaction. You've not obeyed my command, he says, and people have told me that you're not doing it, so I know there's witnesses. And what will God do? Who will you go to? Now here's the nature of their trial. Picture yourself, if you would, in the situation that these men were in. One thing was they would like to save their situation if they could. Why, after all, they had been promoted to quite a high position. There in verse 12 of chapter 3, the accusers note that these Jews have been set over the affairs of the province of Babylon. They were high up in the government. And, they would lose their position as well as perhaps losing their lives if they did not do what Nebuchadnezzar said. So that was one of the trials that they were facing. What were they going to do to save their situation? But also, in order to save their situation, they'd have to sacrifice their conscience. Yeah, that's important. These men had the conscience to know what was right in God's eyes and know what they viewed as right inside them. That's their conscience. And they needed to tell how they're going to handle this. One thing they could do was to conform outwardly, to go ahead and bow down before the image and pretend that they were worshiping and just by the letter of the law do what Nebuchadnezzar said. But of course, if they did that would have meant disobedience to God. The action itself would have been wrong. We know from the Ten Commandments in Exodus chapter 20, God told the people of Israel back there in Moses' time, you shall not make for yourself a carved image, any likeness of anything that is in heaven above, or that is in the earth beneath, or that is in the water under the earth. You shall not bow down to them or serve them. For I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, visiting the iniquity of the fathers to the third and fourth generations of those who hate me. Yes, there was no misunderstanding that God did not want his people bowing down before any idol, and to do so would have meant that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were sacrificing their conscience. Now, what did they do? Well, they went back to the only thing they could. They went back to their faith. We might face similar trials today. We might have to do something, make a decision about whether to do something to save our situation. Maybe our popularity at school would be something we'd want to save. We wouldn't want to not do something other students are doing just, because we might lose our popularity. Or if we do things that our peers and our teachers don't see as wrong, then, if we don't do those things, they're going to think we're strange. Our situation, their perspective of us will be lowered. Teachers and peers may say, oh, it's fine to attend the homecoming dance, and we might really want to go, but dancing is prohibited by God's instructions. And therein lies the problem. Do we save our situation and obliterate what faith tells us? What about at work? We might be tempted to do that which the boss or the company requires. It may be illegal or unethical or immoral. Do we go ahead and do it to save our situation? What are we going to do? To sacrifice our conscience is a serious matter. It would be easy to conform outwardly. We might say, well, I'm going to do the things other students do at school, even though I don't agree with all of it, but I'm going to do that, and I know inside I'm not on board with it. Well, our conscience is being harmed by that. Same thing would be true at work. If we engage in practices that the boss says we must do, but we know they're not ethical, then again, we've sacrificed our conscience. Jesus said in Matthew chapter 7, enter by the narrow gate, for wide is the gate, and broad is the way that leads to destruction, and there are many who go in by it. Because narrow is the gate, and difficult is the way that leads to life, and there are few who find it. Think about that. The many does not necessarily dictate the right way. Our conscience would condemn us, and so would God. If we listen to James chapter 4, verse 17, he says, therefore to him who knows to do good and does not do it, to him it is sin. That covers a lot of things. not just overt actions, but also the holding back of what we should do when we know it would be the right thing. Well, in the big picture then, Daniel and his friends can give us some pretty good instruction. How did they react anyway? Well, first of all, they demonstrated faith. Going back there to Daniel chapter 3, again, we read this. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego answered and said to the king, O Nebuchadnezzar, we have no need to answer you in this matter. If that is the case, our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace, and he will deliver us from your hand, O king. But if not, let it be known to you, O king, that we do not serve your gods, nor will we worship the golden image which you have set up. Couldn't be more clear than that, could it? They're just telling the king, forget it. We're not going to worship as you are instructing us to do so. They determined to serve God no matter what. Sounds kind of like what Job said. Job chapter 13, verse 15. Job, remember, was a good and righteous and upright man before God. And through the instigation of Satan, terrible things happened to him. Here's what he said. Though he slay me, yet will I trust him. Even so, I will defend my own ways before him. You know, Job said, even if God slays me, I still trust him that it's his will somehow. Acts chapter 5, when the apostles were hauled in before the Jewish authorities, and the Pharisees and scribes and the people on the council said this, they brought them and set them before the council, and the high priest asked them, saying, Did we not strictly command you not to teach in this name? And look, you have filled Jerusalem with your doctrine, and intend to wring this man's blood on us. Yeah, we've warned you, and you've done it anyway. Here's Peter and the other apostles' answer. They answered and said, We ought to obey God rather than men. Sounds just about like what the three Hebrew children, the three Jews there, told Nebuchadnezzar. Well, they came out ahead, didn't they? They were saved in the fiery furnace. Starting in verse 19, we read what happened to them. Nebuchadnezzar had that furnace heated up 7 times hotter than ever before, so much so that it burned up the ones who were casting the people in the furnace. They bound them up, and they put their coats, their trousers, their turbans on them, cast them into the burning fiery furnace, and as the people watched, what happened? It says, They fell down bound in the midst of the fiery furnace, but then King Nebuchadnezzar was astonished. He rose in haste and said, Didn't we cast 3 men into the furnace? And they answered and said, Yes, we did. And he says in verse 25, Well, look, I see 4 men loose walking in the midst of the fire. Wait a minute, 4 men loose. They're not bound up anymore. And then he also says, They're not hurt. And in the form of the 4th is like the Son of God. Kind of a prophetic statement there made by Nebuchadnezzar. But they were indeed saved in that fiery furnace. They didn't burn up. They didn't die. They didn't stay bound even. They were up and walking around. And as a result, their triumph was overwhelming. Nebuchadnezzar, when he saw this great triumph that they had shown, he was amazed. In the end of it, in verse 28, he took them out of the furnace, and their hair wasn't singed. They didn't smell like they'd been in a fire at all. Nebuchadnezzar says, Blessed be the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who sent his angel and delivered his servants who trusted in him, and they have frustrated the king's word and yielded their bodies that they should not serve nor worship any god except their own God. Well, that's Nebuchadnezzar's take on the matter. They triumphed over him even. And in verse 29, he even says, I make a decree that any nation or language or people which speaks anything amiss against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego shall be cut in pieces, and their houses shall be made an ash heap, because there is no other God who can deliver like this. Well, and of course, the triumph did not stop there. They were also the benefits that the trial brought them. You know, we told about how they were not bound anymore. They had a sense of freedom from the bonds that they had. James chapter 1, James says, My brethren, count it all joy when you fall into various trials, knowing that the testing of your faith produces patience. Let patience have its perfect work, that you may be perfect and complete, lacking nothing. Yeah, count those trials as joyful things. This freedom that the Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego enjoyed was because of this overcoming the trial. They had a new sense of fellowship too. There in the chapter with third chapter, 25th verse, they had fellowship with this entity, this figure who is like the Son of God. Fellowship with God. We can have the same fellowship. Revelation chapter 3, the writer here is John, speaking the words of Jesus. He who overcomes, I will make him a pillar in the temple of my God, and he shall go out no more. I will write on him the name of my God and the name of the city of my God, the new Jerusalem, which comes down out of heaven from my God. And I will write on him my new name. Who is that? It's he who overcomes. Verse 21 of that same chapter says, to him who overcomes, I will grant to sit with me on my throne, as I also overcame and sat down with my Father on his throne. The Lord Jesus Christ here becomes one with whom we have fellowship when we overcome those obstacles that get in our way. And of course, a new opportunity for service came about there in chapter 3 of Daniel in verse 30. After all this, what happened? Then the king promoted Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the province of Babylon. They went even higher up the ladder of service in his kingdom. Matthew chapter 25, the story there, Jesus told the parable about the talents. Noted that the one who had received the 5 talents went out and earned 5 more. He did what he was supposed to with his. And here's what the Lord tells him. So he who had received 5 talents came and brought 5 other talents, saying, Lord, you delivered to me 5 talents. Look, I've gained 5 more talents beside them. His Lord said to him, well done, good and faithful servant. You were faithful over a few things. I will make you ruler over many things. Enter into the joy of your Lord. That seems to be a valid principle there. Overcoming our trials enables God to give us even more opportunities to serve him. The important outcome here, though, is what we saw happening when Nebuchadnezzar praises God, the king of Babylon, saying there is no God like him. That's a significant outcome right there. Our faith and our works should be to the praise of God, not to bring glory to us. In the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew 5 and verse 16, Jesus said, let your light shine before all men, that they may see your good works and glorify your Father in heaven. The good works that we do, the things that we show by our overcoming of problems and obstacles, that brings praise to God. We might ask some questions here as we wrap up this afternoon. What kind of faith do we have anyway? Looking back at how Daniel showed his faith and how the 3 Jewish princes showed theirs, is our faith like a spare tire, only used in case of an emergency? That's how some folks view faith. It's there, but you only have to drag it out when there's a real urgent need for it. Or is our faith like a wheelbarrow, easily upset, and it has to be pushed? You know what I mean there. The wheelbarrow is not the most stable of conveyances, and if our faith is like that, it's easily turned over. Must it be pushed to get any action out of it? Is our faith like a bus, one of our city buses here, ridden only when it goes our way? Well, yes. Faith, sometimes we ditch our faith if things are not going the way we want them to. Those are some principles that we might want to think about. Well, as we close our study this afternoon, we appreciate you joining in with us. And I would appreciate very much if you'd like to post comments or thoughts or insights or criticisms or whatever, if you will, on the YouTube comments section at the bottom of this video. We are encouraging everyone to continue doing those things that you should do as brothers and sisters in Christ to help those who have needs during this time when we aren't able to meet together. We will still be meeting on Sunday at 11 a.m. for a 1-hour period of worship. Come and join us then if you feel that you're able, and if it's no risk. We don't want you to take undue risks. Please use good common sense about your situation, but we are still meeting that way. Later on, we're going to consider whether and when we'll be able to resume full schedule of services. Please consider the lessons that we've learned this evening. this afternoon and put them to use. And if you want to go back and view other lessons that we've presented, just go to the YouTube channel and you'll find every lesson we've ever done there recorded for us. I guess they stay there forever. I don't think they ever go away. Thank you again, and may God bless you.